Kate McCann, come back to you at Downing Street. Big speech tonight by Rishi Sunak, really owning this issue of the small boats, one of his 5 pledges. But he was there on his own, Home Secretary, who's come up with this plan, sitting in front of him, along with the media. But let's take a look at what Rishi Sunak said.
That if you come here illegally, you can't claim asylum. You can't benefit from our modern slavery protections. You can't make spurious human rights claims. And you can't stay. And once you are removed, you will be banned, as you are in America and Australia, from ever re-entering our country. Now, I understand there will be debate about the toughness of these measures. All I can say is, we have tried it every other way, and it has not worked.
You know, I watched it all, Kate, with great interest. I mean, once again, I'm going to say this, I do find it quite comforting. We have a Prime Minister who can string a sentence together and doesn't sound like a blithering idiot. And he made a passionate and pretty eloquent argument, really, for nothing else has worked. Let's try this. The problem, it seems to me, is I'm not convinced it will work either. What's the general consensus about it?
I think that's right, Piers. Look, there are 2 questions here. One of them is a legal issue and one of them is a practicality question. On the first one, Suella Braverman, who, as you said, was in the front row of that press conference watching the Prime Minister give that speech, she's written on the front of this bill to say, look, I can't guarantee that what we're trying to do will meet the terms of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, that's a huge problem. That's basically the Home Secretary admitting that this is probably going to get dragged through the courts. And we know what that means because we're seeing it play out with the Rwanda policy, which, by the way, is a key part of this new pledge. It requires the Rwanda policy to make it work. So that's the first issue. How does it work legally? I think there are lots of MPs tonight who would like to see this work in practice, but who still have big legal doubts. And I asked the Prime Minister, well, look, if it does get gummed up in the courts, would you be prepared to leave the ECHR? That's what some Tories want, what reportedly the Home Secretary wants. And he said, no, we won't need to do that. I think we can get this through. So we need to see whether that's possible. The second issue is the practicality of this, because what the government is proposing is that if you arrive here in the UK illegally on a boat, you will be detained, you will be processed quickly. Now, they're saying days, and then you will either be removed to a safe country or you will be accepted into the UK in some exceptional circumstances. Now, the government can't give me numbers for how many people would be accepted, nor can they give me numbers for how many people would come here via those safe routes. But what I think is really problematic is that if you think about the numbers, Piers, 45,000 people came to the UK last year. If anything near that scale continued to come, the government would have a real problem trying to process that number of people within days. It would take weeks, months, maybe even years. And we don't have the capacity to detain that many people in detention centres, which, by the way, haven't yet been built. Also, we're saying that this legislation won't apply to the people who are already here. It applies if you make that journey from today. It is retrospective, but it's not going to apply to anybody who's already made that journey. So we still have the issue of people in hotels around the country that the government hasn't yet solved.
Yeah. So a bit of a mess. All right, well, Madeline, sell it to me. Do you believe in this? Can it work?
Well, I've yet to see evidence that this policy has kind of teeth that previous efforts to do precisely this don't have. I've yet to see how it would not be subject to being completely gummed up in the courts, as Kate says, where other policies have failed. However, I do wonder if, wait for the experts to properly decode this, but I do wonder if there might be something more substantive here, because if it is just as toothless as previous attempts, then the Prime Minister has created the most tremendous rod for his own back here. You might end up with a policy that is seen very publicly to fail right before the next general election.
Right.
So it's quite a gamble, and I suspect that he would not have spoken in such a sort of strongly worded, positive way about this policy if he didn't think that he had a reasonable chance of actually
I mean, when I interviewed
through.
him last month in Downing Street, he was emphatic that by the end of this year, he would have significantly reduced the number of people coming over on these boats. And he wanted me to go back and interview him again at the end of the year and mark his card. So, I mean, Paula, he is, and today he was there, centre stage, on his own. Suella Braverman sitting in front of him, not on the stage with him. Quite interesting optics. He's really owning this, which makes me think, because he's no fool, Rishi Sunak, that he must think, a bit like with his Brexit deal, he's got a reasonable chance of this working.
I don't see what other choice he has than to believe in himself. because we were told that Brexit would work in terms of immigration. It hasn't done. We were told that Rwanda was going to work in terms of immigration.
That's been a fiasco.
And it hasn't done. And now we are told something again by the same administration. Oh, OK, so we got it wrong that time and we got it wrong this time, but this time it's going to work. And unfortunately for me, as a voter, the optics aren't enough anymore.
Having said that, I mean, there's no doubt, Madeline, that I don't see much from the Labour Party, which makes any sense to me either. I mean, I think this has been a collective mess now for a very long time. And these numbers are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the gangs realise we are weaker and weaker and weaker. Yeah. And one of the big problems, I mean, Kate talked about processing. We're just not processing people. So they're all living at vast expense in quite nice hotels in many cases. That winds everybody up. Yeah. I think most of the public are basically like, sort this out.
Yeah.
Whatever you need to do, it's transparently ridiculous that we're allowing tens of thousands of people to just come on shore on these boats run by criminal gangs. You know, a third of them, as it turned out, from Albania, not a war-torn country. People probably joining gangs already in the UK in many cases. None of this makes sense to the average British voter.
Well, quite. I think, you know, the first responsibility of a government is first and foremost to defend our borders. And from that, everything else springs. And once you've shown that borders are porous and we have no real control over it, then I think it leads to great doubts about the ability of government to do just about anything competently and successfully. And, you know, your point about Labour, I think, is spot on because, you know, say what you want about the Rwanda policy and it hasn't worked, not a single flight has been sent. It is at least an attempt to look at the incentives and the business model.
Yeah, but here's the problem. Here's the problem with it. The problem with it is it's supposed to be a disincentive to people, to the smuggling gangs, the trafficking gangs, to do this. But they're looking at it and see it completely frozen up in courts, and they're laughing their heads off. They're saying, well, this isn't a deterrent to anybody, right? I mean, that's the problem. Yeah. The deterrents aren't working because they're not working. Yeah. So they don't deter.
And please, let's be clear, this is not the fault of my brethren lawyers who are doing their job.
Well, always blame lawyers when in doubt.
You know, this is the fault of a failed government and its failed policies. And you talk about the Labour Party and what the Labour Party has been able to offer, and I can see that you're concerned about that. I did hear Stephen Kinnock say recently in an interview that it's about reaching new agreements. And that's what this government's got to do. No matter what we do here, unless we are able to reach agreement with other countries, it's never going to work.
Right. I mean, Kate McCann, finally back to you. I mean, seems to me the big problem with this is that it's all very well saying we're not going to accept anybody. They're all going to go back. But you've got to make sure that where you want to send them back to agrees to take them. And that doesn't seem to have been agreed in advance. So I'm not, you know, we got one deal with Albania, but I'm not aware of any other deals where countries have agreed to take anybody back.
Yes, so there's two things here, and that's a really interesting point because Rishi Sunak, during that press conference today, made the same point a number of times, talking about returns agreements and the importance of them. He also said this legislation isn't a silver bullet and it's part of a package of measures the government is going to need to introduce. He said it wouldn't happen quickly. And the reason he said that, he's going to meet President Macron in France, in Paris, on Friday. Now, we expect that this, you know, the issue of cross-channel migrants will come up. Unlikely to be some big deal unveiled about a returns agreement, but that's certainly what the Prime Minister is hoping for because they believe that that would also help disincentivise people. And Piers, I think that's the point. What you guys were just discussing there in the studio, the government sees this just as much as a deterrent, as a publicity campaign, if you like, as it does as a working policy. What they hope is that the people smugglers and those listening to this conversation will hear the government saying we're going to apply this retrospectively, so it's going to start straight away. Even if you try and push loads of people through the channel tomorrow, this will apply to them, so don't think you can get around it. And that in doing that, they will make it more difficult for people to want to make that journey, effectively saying to people, look, don't waste your money. These smugglers are not going to be able to give you what you want. The Rwanda policy is a key part of that, and the government believes that actually lawyers have said that it is legal. It does meet the terms of the legal agreements that the government has signed up to internationally. It is now it's going through the appeals process. They're going to have to wait to see how that comes out. But the government did win the first stage of that battle, so I think there is some optimism that they can get that through. They need to in order to make this new legislation
well, that's
today
it. And the
work,
problem for Rishi Sunak
behind the scenes are saying.
Right. The problem for Rishi is the clock is ticking, and he hasn't got much time. You know, he's got to call an election within 20 months, so he hasn't got much time. Kate McCann, thank you very much indeed.